The silence at 40,000 feet is not peaceful, it is absolute. It is a vacuum where human emotion is stripped away by the sheer velocity of forward momentum, leaving only the cold, mechanical reality of instrument panels and the steady, rhythmic hiss of oxygen flowing through a rubber mask. When you're flying a multi-million-dollar piece of military hardware through a designated corridor, the world below ceases to be a collection of homes, neighborhoods, and interpersonal betrayals. It becomes a grid. It becomes a series of coordinates, vector headings, and radar returns. Down there on the surface, people lie. They scheme, they look at a piece of paper, a legal deed, or a family inheritance, and they see a vulnerability to exploit. But up here, there is no room for deception. The laws of aerodynamics do not care about family loyalty, and the navigation computer does not recognize the emotional weight of a forged signature. 3 weeks before my scheduled deployment to a joint command facility in Western Europe, my older brother Julian stood in the kitchen of our family's country estate, a property that had survived 3 generations of economic downturns solely because my military salary had quietly absorbed its mounting debts for nearly a decade. He looked me in the eye, adjusted his tailored linen jacket, and told me that my insistence on keeping the estate under strict financial trusts was holding the family back from its true potential. He called my caution an occupational hazard, a symptom of a rigid military mindset that couldn't understand the fluid, fast-paced world of corporate real estate. My mother sat at the oak table, carefully avoiding my gaze, her silence serving as an explicit endorsement of his ambition. They saw me as the dependable, unseen pillar, the daughter who wore a flight suit, stayed overseas for 10 months at a time, and wired quarterly stipends without demanding an itemized ledger. To them, I was a utility, an asset to be managed, a low-level operator whose absence created a convenient vacuum. They believed that because my life was defined by discipline and official secrecy, I would lack the stomach for a public, messy domestic dispute. They assumed that a power of attorney granted years ago for simple administrative maintenance while I was stationed in remote operating zones was a blank check for reconstruction. What they failed to realize, what they completely omitted from their opportunistic calculations, was that the very training they dismissed as rigid had taught me how to read an approaching threat long before it appeared on a standard radar sweep. They did not know that when they signed the foreclosure notice and the subsequent private sale agreement to clear Julian's commercial debts, they weren't just transferring a piece of land. They were altering a flight plan. They were placing their newly acquired corporate coordinates directly underneath a restricted military airspace corridor that I had spent the last 6 months securing for low-altitude tactical maneuvers. The auctioneer's gavel in that wood-paneled county courthouse was scheduled to fall at precisely 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Julian had timed it perfectly, knowing I would be thousands of miles away, locked inside a secure communication vault, unable to answer civilian phone calls or review personal banking notifications. He thought the distance was his armor. He thought the bureaucracy of the United States Air Force would act as a silencer, keeping me contained while they liquidated the only tangible legacy our father had left behind. But distance is a relative concept when you operate in Mach numbers. As the clock on the courthouse wall ticked toward the hour of execution, the air pressure over that small, arrogant valley was already beginning to shift. The family didn't know that my signature wasn't just on a disputed property deed. It was logged into a flight authorization form approved by a regional command structure that takes a very dark view of civilian interference with its personnel's legal protections. They believed they were quietly closing a real estate deal out from under an absent soldier. They were actually establishing ground zero for a calculated, systemic legal and professional interception that would shatter the windows of their carefully constructed deception. To understand how a family arrives at the point of liquidating their own blood's livelihood while they are serving overseas, you have to understand the quiet, corrosive nature of generational entitlement. For 34 years, I was the observer in our household. My father had been a logistics officer, a man who viewed life through the lens of supply lines, contingency plans, and structural integrity. When he passed away, the estate in the Northern Valley, an expansive property with deep agricultural roots and an old stone-built manor, was left to my mother with the explicit legal proviso that its ownership would eventually transition to both Julian and myself. But Julian never understood supply lines. He understood appearances. He viewed the estate not as a responsibility to be maintained, but as collateral to be leveraged for his various venture capital schemes in the city. Every time one of Julian's boutique investment firms or luxury logistics startups faltered, our mother would look to me. Not to Julian for accountability, but to me for stabilization. Because I had chosen the academy, because I had a guaranteed government salary, and because my living expenses were largely covered by the military, it became an unspoken family law that my income was a communal reserve. When the roof needed replacing, it was my wire transfer that paid the contractors. When the property taxes spiked during the economic readjustment of the early 2020s, it was my combat deployment bonus that cleared the county ledger. I did it without complaint, not because I was naive, but because discipline dictates that you protect your perimeter. I thought I was protecting my family's heritage. In reality, I was funding their dependency. Julian viewed my career with a patronizing, subtle condescension. To him, an officer in the aviation brigade was just an advanced chauffeur for government equipment. He would sit at dinner parties on the rare occasions I returned home, swirling a glass of expensive wine paid for by my maintenance stipends, and explain to his urban associates how my life was simple, bounded by regulations and lack of personal autonomy. He couldn't conceive of a world where status wasn't measured by the brand of your watch or the speed of your car. He certainly didn't understand that the discipline required to manage a high-altitude tactical flight crew is the exact same discipline required to dismantle a fraudulent financial structure piece by piece. The shift began 6 months ago, just as my squadron was assigned to a rotational deployment at a strategic airbase in Northern Europe. The region was a high-intensity training environment, a landscape of deep fjords, narrow valleys, and heavily regulated airspace corridors designed for low visibility, high-speed terrain masking. Before I deployed, Julian had approached me with a set of documents, claiming they were routine updates for the estate's agricultural zoning. His tone was hurried, his eyes darting to his phone, the classic behavior of a man trying to obscure the details with artificial urgency. He needed my signature on a limited power of attorney to handle the local council disputes while I was out of the country. I looked at the papers, saw the standard legal headers, and felt a familiar, cold instinct click into place. It was the same feeling you get when an indicator light on the secondary hydraulic system flickers for a fraction of a second, not an outright failure, but an anomaly that demands verification. I signed the document, but I didn't file it through his recommended notary. Instead, I took it to our base Judge Advocate General Officer, a sharp, unyielding military lawyer who had spent 2 decades pulling service members out of predatory civilian contracts. I told him to place a silent monitoring flag on the estate's title deed at the county recorder's office. If any major transactional adjustments were attempted using that power of attorney, an automated alert would route directly to my secure military email address, regardless of where I was stationed in the world. I didn't want to believe my brother would cross that line. I didn't want to believe my mother would allow it, but in aviation, you don't fly on hope, you fly on cross-checked instrumentation. And 2 weeks into my deployment, while sitting in a cold, concrete briefing room after an 8-hour night patrol over the North Sea, the monitor screen on my terminal flashed red. Julian had filed the papers, but he hadn't updated a zoning law. He had listed the entire estate for an expedited private auction to satisfy a personal line of credit that was on the verge of default. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was operational. In the documentation Julian submitted to the county court, he had attached an affidavit stating that I was currently unreachable, placed on an extended classified assignment with no predictable return date, and that my absence threatened the immediate solvency of the family asset. He had used my service, my commitment to national security, as the very justification to strip away my legal standing. He told the court that as the primary resident agent, he needed to liquidate the property to prevent a catastrophic foreclosure. The buyer was a shell corporation tied to a commercial developer he had been trying to impress for years. They wanted the land for a private luxury resort, exploiting the valley's scenic isolation. I sat in my quarters, the European winter wind rattling the reinforced glass of the barracks window, reading through the digital copies of the filings. The cold anger that settled over me was different from civilian rage. It wasn't loud, it wasn't panicked. It was a calculated, methodical narrowing of focus. My brother thought he had engineered the perfect crime of opportunity because he assumed my operational environment locked me behind an impenetrable wall of bureaucracy. He thought I was powerless because I was distant. What his civilian mind failed to grasp is that the military operates its own global legal, financial, and logistical network that can move with terrifying speed when an officer's readiness is threatened by domestic fraud. I immediately initiated a secure conference with Major Vance, my JAG representative. We sat on an encrypted video link, the screen illuminating his severe, lined face. He reviewed the documents Julian had filed and noted that under the Service Members' Civil Relief Act, the sale of a deployed active duty officer's primary asset without explicit judicial review is not just a civil violation. It is a federal offense that carries severe systemic penalties for both the individuals and the financial institutions involved. But Vance also pointed out a tactical complication. Julian had used a local, cooperative county judge who was notoriously sympathetic to regional development projects and often overlooked federal military protections if the paperwork appeared neat on the surface. If we filed a standard stay of execution through the civilian courts, it could take weeks to process, allowing the sale to close and the title to transfer to the shell corporation. Once the title transferred, reversing the physical destruction of the estate would become a protracted, multi-year legal nightmare. We needed a direct, unignorable disruption. We needed something that would force the civilian authorities, the auctioneer, and the prospective buyers to halt the proceedings on the spot, creating a legal freeze that Julian could not talk his way out of. That was when I opened the regional tactical maps for our upcoming low-altitude training deployment. My squadron had been tasked with practicing terrain masking runs, high-speed, low-level flights designed to test radar avoidance in mountainous topography. The training routes were strictly managed by international military aviation authorities, but the entry and exit corridors were determined by squadron commanders based on tactical necessity and safety parameters. As I studied the digital topography of my home valley, I realized something Julian had completely overlooked in his haste to sell the land. The estate sat directly beneath an established, but rarely used, low-altitude military aviation corridor known as Route Delta II. It was an airspace sector reserved for supersonic transitional training, typically kept active only during seasonal maneuvers. Because the valley was sparsely populated, the noise restrictions were minimal, allowing aircraft to descend to within 500 feet of the deck under specific training profiles. I looked at the schedule for our final tactical evaluation run. It was set for the exact same Tuesday morning as Julian's private auction. The coordinates of the county courthouse sat less than 2 miles from the primary low-altitude approach path. I didn't ask for a favor. I didn't violate a single protocol. I simply submitted an operational adjustment to my commanding officer, citing the necessity of testing terrain-following radar systems against the specific, steep ridgelines surrounding that northern valley. I noted that the valley's atmospheric conditions on that specific Tuesday provided the ideal density altitude for a high-speed, low-level simulated interception profile. My commander, an old-school fighter pilot who viewed any domestic interference with his crew's focus as an act of direct hostility, looked at the chart, looked at me, and stamped the flight plan with his official approval. Julian thought he was operating in a quiet, isolated local court where his connections gave him total control. He had no idea that his little real estate auction was now directly embedded in the mission profile of 2 twin-engine tactical strike fighters moving at 600 knots. The psychological pressure of waiting for an operation to commence is something civilians rarely experience. To them, time is a fluid sequence of events. To an aviator, it is a rigid countdown where every second corresponds to a specific distance covered over the ground. On Monday night, 12 hours before the auction, I received an automated notification from the county recorder's office. The final clearance had been granted. The auctioneer, an associate of Julian's business partner, had verified the forged power of attorney and cleared the docket for the 11 o'clock sale. I also received a brief, dismissive text message from Julian, the first he had sent me in 2 months. It read, "Taking care of some old administrative loose ends at the house this week. Don't worry about the mail or the statements for a while, just focus on your deployment. We have everything under control here." The sheer audacity of the message was a study in sociopathic entitlement. He wasn't just stealing the property, he was attempting to manage my psychology, trying to ensure I remained passive until the legal window for an immediate appeal had closed. I didn't reply. In the air, you don't engage in radio arguments with an adversary who is out of position. You simply adjust your radar tracking and lock on the target. Tuesday morning arrived with crisp, severe clarity. The European airbase was shrouded in a light morning fog. But the satellite weather intelligence indicated that the skies over my home valley across the ocean were perfectly clear. High visibility, cold air, and an exceptionally high atmospheric pressure that would amplify the acoustic signature of a jet engine to an extraordinary degree. I walked out to the tarmac at 800 hours local time, my flight boots crunching on the frost-coated concrete. My wingman, Captain Miller, walked beside me, his helmet bag swinging in his gloved hand. He knew the parameters of the run. He knew that our target wasn't a simulated missile site today. It was a specific geographical intersection defined by a small, historic brick courthouse and an adjacent valley floor. We climbed into the cockpits of our aircraft, the twin engines roaring to life with a familiar, low-frequency vibration that settles deep in your chest. As I taxied toward the active runway, the civilian world with its petty betrayals and family dynamic faded behind the checklists. I was no longer the undervalued daughter who paid the bills in silence. I was the lead pilot of a tactical element, responsible for 40,000 pounds of advanced technology, moving under federal orders. We cleared the tower, slammed the throttles forward into afterburner, and tore into the gray European sky, climbing rapidly to our transit altitude before setting our course westward across the ocean corridor. Meanwhile, according to the legal logs my JAG officer was tracking in real time from the base command center, the scene at the county courthouse was unfolding exactly as Julian had planned. The main courtroom had been reserved for the private bidding session. The prospective buyers, representatives from the luxury resort development firm, were seated in the front row, their legal teams holding leather briefcases containing the transfer contracts. My mother sat in the second row, her head down, clutching a designer handbag that had undoubtedly been purchased with the funds I had sent home for the estate's emergency structural repairs. Julian stood near the podium, speaking in low, confident tones to the auctioneer. He had presented the court with the document bearing my signature, reassuring the judge that I was completely informed and fully supportive of the liquidation to save the family from financial ruin. They were less than 15 minutes away from the final stroke of the gavel. They believed the only thing left to do was witness the formal transfer of title and divide the residual cash among Julian's creditors. They had absolutely no concept of the physical reality that was currently converging on their position at 500 feet above the valley floor. At exactly 10:57 a.m. local time over the valley, my wingman and I dropped out of the high-altitude transit corridor, descending through a thick layer of scattered clouds until the familiar green and gray ridges of my childhood home filled the heads-up display. We dropped to 600 feet above the deck, our airspeeds climbing toward the upper limit of subsonic flight. The terrain following radar was painting the valley walls in sharp, neon lines on my screen. I could see the layout of the old estate to my left, the stone house, the barns, the land I had spent my youth protecting. And straight ahead, tucked into the crease of the valley, was the sharp brick outline of the county seat. Inside the courtroom, the auctioneer raised his wooden gavel. He read the final terms of the sale, citing the specific authority granted by the power of attorney submitted by Julian Farouk Shah. He asked if there were any further civil objections or competing bids from the floor. Julian stood by the window, a smug smile on his face, looking out over the quiet town square, believing he had successfully executed the ultimate financial extraction. At 10:59 a.m., the sound hit them. It didn't start as a noise. It started as a sudden, violent drop in air pressure that made everyone in the room grip their chairs. The heavy glass panes of the courthouse windows began to vibrate, a low, resonant hum that quickly escalated into a deafening, metallic rattle. A shadow, massive, dark, and impossibly fast, streaked across the town square at 500 feet, followed less than a second later by the absolute, earth-shattering roar of two military turbofan engines operating at maximum dry thrust. The acoustic energy slammed into the brick building, cracking the ancient plaster on the courtroom ceiling and causing several of the decorative light fixtures to shatter onto the floor. The room erupted into immediate, unmitigated panic. The developers dropped their briefcases, their high-priced lawyers ducking beneath the wooden benches, convinced they were under an actual kinetic attack. Julian was thrown off balance by the sheer physical shockwave, his hands slamming against the window frame as he stared up into the sky, his face completely drained of color. Before the echo of the first pass could even clear the ridge line, my wingman followed, executing a tight, high-G bank directly over the courthouse roof, his engine exhaust creating a physical tremor that rattled the very foundations of the building. Before the auctioneer could even regain his footing or pick up his dropped gavel, the rear doors of the courtroom swung open with a heavy, deliberate thud. Major Vance, dressed in his immaculate, razor-sharp Air Force Service dress uniform, stepped into the room, flanked by two armed federal marshals. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at my mother. He walked straight down the center aisle, placed a certified federal injunction directly on the judge's bench, and spoke in a clear, unyielding tone that carried across the stunned, silent room. He informed the court that the property under consideration was currently under a comprehensive federal military stay of execution, issued under the authority of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. He presented the verified digital records proving that the power of attorney had been flagged for fraud, and that the active duty officer who owned 50% of the primary asset was currently leading a tactical aviation mission overhead. He noted, for the record, that any civilian attempt to finalize the sale of that asset, while that officer was airborne under federal orders, would result in the immediate arrest of the transactional parties for international financial fraud against military personnel. The developers didn't wait for the judge to rule. They grabbed their documents, scrambled out of the side doors, and completely severed their ties with Julian before they even reached the parking lot. Julian stood there, his hands trembling, looking at the federal marshals, and then looking up as the distant, fading rumble of my aircraft echoed one last time over the northern ridge. He had spent his entire life thinking he could outmaneuver the quiet sister who lived by a code of discipline. He learned in 30 seconds that when you try to steal from someone who commands the sky, your entire ground game becomes entirely irrelevant. The estate remains ours, or rather, it remains mine, secured under a permanent, ironclad military trust that Julian can never touch. He is currently facing a federal grand jury investigation for document forgery and violation of service member protection laws, a reality that his corporate connections cannot solve. My mother still lives in the small cottage on the edge of the land, completely dependent on the controlled, strictly managed monthly allowance I provide through my legal team. She no longer talks about Julian's grand business ambitions. When you operate at 40,000 feet, you learn a fundamental truth about human nature. Those who scream the loudest on the ground are usually the ones who possess the least amount of actual altitude. True power doesn't require a tailored suit, a patronizing explanation, or a deceptive legal maneuver. True power is the quiet, disciplined execution of a plan that your adversary never saw coming until the shadow of it is already passing over their head. If you have ever had to quietly carry the weight of an ungrateful family, or if you have ever had to watch people who never sacrificed a single day of their lives try to profit off your absence, comment, stand your ground below. Let me know in the comments, would you have signed the legal release form to let them off the hook, or would you have let the military lawyers strip their assets down to the bare walls? Tell me your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more strategic deep dives into the psychological reality of absolute redemption.